The year is 1692 and the place is Port Royal, Jamaica. It is one of the largest and busiest trading centers in the New World, and it is famous throughout the Caribbean for being a swashbuckling pirate's paradise. Its streets are lined with fortune tellers, fortune seekers, and fortunes in between. There is no other city quite like it in all of the Americas. Port Royal was an anomaly in many ways. It was an English colonial city which turned a blind eye to things like theft, gambling, murder and prostitution, and it was even known to tolerate Jews, atheists, pacifists, and people of other races and religions. So it shouldn't be surprising that the place was known throughout the world as the richest and wickedest city in the New World. But this image of Port Royal would soon come crashing down when a massive earthquake shook the island and 2/3 of the city was swallowed by the sea. In the early 1650s, Jamaica was a rather uninhabited island with only a few small settlements inhabited by the Arawak and Taino people. That was until the English showed up in May of 1655, bringing with them diseases that devastated the local population and enslaving or killing the rest. Soon after, they began building a fort on the southern coast of the island where two natural harbors protected a wide shallow shelf of land from the elements, making it the perfect place for a settlement. This place would be named Port Royal. During the Anglo-Spanish War, the English used the fort as a base of operations to harass and attack the Spanish. But it quickly became apparent that the fort was not going to provide enough economic opportunities for the growing colony of Jamaica. In addition to food shortages, the governor at the time petitioned the English government to allow the settlers to capture and enslave the surviving indigenous people of the island. The English government denied this request, though, stating that enslaving the native peoples went against the wishes of King Charles I. However, despite this setback, by 1660, Port Royal had become a bustling center of trade and commerce. Much of this trade involved agricultural products such as sugar, tobacco, and cotton, which were produced by the labor of those captured or born into slavery on the island. By the turn of the century, there were around 1,500 enslaved people working on the sugar plantations round Port Royal. Due to the nature of the work, most of these enslaved people lived on the plantations where they labored. But a non-insignificant amount of them did live within the town itself. As Port Royal grew, it attracted a variety of merchants, artisans, shopkeepers, and sailors from all over the world. And this mixture of people brought with them a cacophony of languages, religions, and traditions, which contributed to the city's unique character. Not only was Port Royal one of the largest and busiest trading centers in the New World, but it was also one of the most prosperous cities on the island. The wealth of the city could be seen in the grand homes of its merchants and planters, many of whom built their homes on stilts over the water. Port Royal was also home to a number of well-known pirates, including Henry Morgan, who made his fortune plundering Spanish ships and ports. In fact, the city's reputation as a pirate's paradise was so well known that the English government actually chartered privateers to attack Spanish shipping in the Caribbean. Privateers were essentially legalized pirates, and these privateers used Port Royal as their base of operations. They would sail out to sea and attack any Spanish ship or port that they could find. The booty they stole during these attacks was then sold in Port Royal, where the riches of the Spanish Empire were divided among the crew. What made Port Royal so unique was that unlike other colonial cities in the New World, it didn't try to hide these activities. The people of Port Royal knew that the city's prosperity depended on the wealth brought in by the privateers, and so they welcomed them with open arms. In fact, the city's leaders even helped the privateers by providing them with supplies and information about Spanish shipping. So it should be no surprise that Port Royal became known as one of the wildest cities in the New World. The people of Port Royal were a rough and tumble bunch, and they liked to live fast and loose. Gambling and drinking were popular pastimes, and the city was full of fortune tellers and fortune seekers. There was also no shortage of crime in Port Royal. The city was full of thieves and cutthroats, and the law was often powerless to stop them. In fact, the city's leaders actually encouraged this behavior to some extent. They knew that a city that was known for its debauchery and lawlessness would be less likely to be targeted by the authorities back in England. But what really made Port Royal stand out was its attitude towards religion. The people of Port Royal were tolerant of all religions, or at least they were willing to tolerate all religions as long as they didn't interfere with the city's business. There were churches in Port Royal, but they were outnumbered by taverns and gambling halls. And if you wanted to attend a religious service, you could do so without fear of persecution. You could even practice your religion freely without fear of persecution. Of course, this tolerance didn't extend to the Spanish, who were considered the enemy. But for everyone else, Port Royal was a place where you could go to escape the religious fervor of Europe. However, this freedom of religion wasn't just a product of Port Royal's unique circumstances. It was also a reflection of the character of the people who lived there. The people of Port Royal were a mix of fortune seekers, religious refugees, criminals and adventurers. They were people who were looking for a new start in life, or at least a place where they could live according to their own beliefs without being persecuted. However, in spite of all this religious tolerance, there were still limits to how far Port Royal's leaders were willing to go. For example, the city's leaders did not allow human sacrifice, despite the fact that it was legal in England at the time. And they also banned cannibalism, although this was probably more of a practical decision since cannibalism can spread disease and was unlikely to attract settlers to the city. Despite all of these problems, Port Royal continued to flourish throughout the 1670s. The city's wealth continued to grow and its population continued to boom. By the end of the decade, Port Royal was one of the largest and most prosperous cities in the New World. However, all of this would change on June 7, 1692. On that day, a massive earthquake struck the island of Jamaica, causing widespread damage and loss of life. The earthquake caused the land to sink, creating a large chasm in the middle of the city. 2/3 of Port Royal was submerged underwater, killing thousands of people and destroying the city's economy. Today, what remains of Port Royal is located in the waters off the coast of Jamaica. The earthquake that destroyed the city also created a unique and historically significant underwater archaeological site. The ruins of Port Royal are now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and divers from all over the world come to explore the underwater ruins of this once great city. What do you think was the main reason that Port Royal became such a successful city? Do you think its success would have been more if it hadn't been destroyed? Or do you think that its fate was sealed once it started embracing such lawless behavior? Let me know in the comments below. If you want to know more about the history of Jamaica, stay tuned for more information. And as always, thank you so much for watching.